All right, hi everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hopefully you made it through the fog. I shall actually my best to cut it apart today. It's always nice when you can't see the skylines, like chopped in half. Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone had a nice week so far. Let's see. Any questions? Anything in your mind from last class regarding the line item veto, or Ines Fichata, or Clinton v. New York? Any questions? Anything in your mind? Okay. Today is going to be a fun class, and I hope you all did the reading in its entirety. I only assigned one decision. It was long, but it's very important, and it's probably the most important separation of powers decision by the Supreme Court since Youngstown itself. So I hope you read it, and if you didn't, you realize, well, you should have read it very soon because we'll be going through it in detail. In our last class, we did two cases. We did Ines Fichata, and we did Clinton v. City of New York. And these were both efforts by Congress and the President to finagle, shift around, if you will, the separation of powers, right? The line item veto act case, I'm sorry, the Ines Fichata case, the first case we did, said, all right, we're going to pass a law, but if the President does something we don't like with that law, one house of Congress can veto it. And the Supreme Court said, nuh-uh, not going to happen. Why? Because the separation of powers are in place for a reason. Even though it may be efficient and convenient for the House to be able to veto these removal of deportations or whatever for the immigrants, that's not how our separation of powers works. One house cannot give power to the other house, right? The second case presented the situation in reverse. Clinton v. City of New York. Here, both the President and Congress agreed that if the President doesn't want to spend certain amounts of money, he doesn't have to. And you recall there was a spirited debate in that case between the majority and Justice Stevens and Justices Breyer and Scalia in dissent. And the majority said, listen, Congress can pass a law and the President can execute it. There's no in-between. The President can't decide which laws he wants to enforce or not. Justice Breyer, you may recall, dissented. And Justice Breyer said, listen, both President and the Congress agree on this, right? When both parties agree that this is a better way to run government, why should the court get in their way? Justice Kennedy had a concurring opinion, you might recall, saying, no. This is not how things work. The separation of powers is important to protect freedom and individual liberty. We can't trust the political branches to shift power amongst themselves. This is something for our entire republic, and not just for the legislature and the executive to agree on. And what Kennedy said is the courts must step in when the branches try to, violate these separation of powers. And what did our favorite Justice Scalia say? Scalia said, listen, you guys got faked out, right? You got faked out. This is not a line item veto. This is giving the President discretion to spend or not spend money. So Scalia says, listen, yeah, separation of powers is really fragile, but that's not what this law does. Okay? So in that case, we see this divide, right? We have Justice Kennedy who's saying, listen, we need to have this separation of powers to protect freedom. We have Justice Breyer who's saying, listen, if both Congress and the President agree and they like this, who are we to stop them? And you have Scalia saying, let's look at what the law actually does and be very careful. These exact philosophies reemerge in Noel Canning, I think, as many of you are now recognizing. One thing which I want you to do in this class, which is why I talk a lot about the justices, is try and figure out how they rule over time. Clinton v. New York was 1996. Noel Canning was 2014. You have the same justices fighting over the same issues in different contexts. And if you'll notice, in both Justice Breyer's majority opinion and Justice Scalia's concurring opinion, who did they cite over and over again? Justice Kennedy. How many times did Justice Scalia cite Kennedy's concurring opinion, Clinton v. New York? Like a dozen times? So I'll give you some background. When the justices write opinions, they're not set in stone. Votes change. We'll learn that very well with Obamacare. Votes often change. Scalia was trying to buy Kennedy's vote here. He was trying to say, listen, Tony, Anthony Kennedy, listen, Tony, they're actually neighbors, by the way. Scalia and Kennedy live in the same block. It's kind of funny. He's like, listen, Tony, you said all this great stuff about the separation of powers in Clinton v. New York. What's going on, man? What are you going to do? And then Breyer also cited Kennedy's previous opinion. So we'll learn a lot about our Supreme Overlord, Anthony Kennedy, because he is responsible for almost all the important 5-4 decisions in the last 2 decades. He is often what's called the swing vote. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but often his vote decides which way the court goes one way or the other. Okay? So this is a very significant case that's extremely timely. It was decided 6 months ago. It's so new, it's not even in your book yet. That's how new it is. Unlike most classes where they print new textbooks every year for whatever reason to make money, ConLaw, they actually need to print new books every couple of years because the cases change a lot. Property hasn't changed much in 800 years. It's pretty much the same stuff. But I'm serious, not exaggerating much. But ConLaw changes a lot. All right, so any questions before we get started? Okay, where did I finish last time? I actually don't remember. Ish, there? They calling you yet? Okay. You're not, okay, Michael. I'll start there, okay? Michael, I'll give you an easy one to start off. What is the normal route by which the president can appoint officers to the United States government? You know, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury. What's the normal primary route that the president has to take? Spell it out, be more precise. What has to happen? I'll give you a hint. Turn to page 30 in your Constitution. Right? And in case you don't want it, also up there. Can you see if it's not tilted, make sure you tell me. I'll rotate it for you. Right? Michael, what's the process? And you can read up there if it's easier, or in your Constitution on page 30. What's the process by which the president can appoint officers of the United States?
Shall nominate.
Okay, so he nominates them, so he puts a name forward, and then what happens?
The Senate then has to, on their consent, they'll consent to it.
So what does advice consent mean?
They'll pretty much decide whether or not
Yeah. Thumbs up or thumbs down, right? This is a straight majority vote. Majority in the Senate agree, that's advice and consent, and the president's officer gets his commission, right? This is basically Marbury. We did this in the very first week of class. Jefferson nominated all these judges. The Senate confirmed them, and they had their position. Now, of course, Mr. Marbury never got his commission because Marshall was lazy. But in theory, once the Senate does its job and the president signs it, it's a done deal. All right. But this isn't the only method by which the president can appoint officers of the United States. That's Sarah? Mm-hmm. Sarah, what's the other method, what might be called an alternate method?
Sorry.
I can't hear what you're saying.
1 second.
You don't need to look at your screen. It's up there. It's on the screen. What's the alternate method by which the president can appoint officers?
Just fills up vacancies whenever the Senate is in recess.
Oh, you got to read it. Don't try and summarize it because we'll be focusing on this text for a long time. What is the exact method? Just read it, please.
The president shall have the power to fill out all vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. Okay, good. So we see here in the Constitution something about filling up filling up vacancies during recess. What this clause means, in particular, the words I highlighted, may happen, recess of the Senate, right? What these 3 provisions mean has been debated and argued over for 200 years. And it bitterly divided the Supreme Court by a vote of 5-4 6 months ago. Okay? This case tries to give meaning to these few words by looking at the text, right? History and practice. How has this actually worked between the president and the Senate? I think what you'll find is there are pretty good arguments on both sides here. I think what you'll find when you read the majority opinion by Justice Breyer and Justice Scalia's concurring opinion is there pretty good points and there are pretty good weaknesses. That both sides have their respective strengths and weaknesses, and you can decide for yourself which you like better. But this is a very tight question. So let's walk through this one step at a time, right? So is that Demi? So first, let's focus on the first phrase, the recess. What's a recess? A break. What are the two different kinds of recesses, Demi, that there can be?
There was the inter and intra recess.
Very good. There are two types of recesses in the Senate. I'll explain this more in a minute. There's intersession and intra-session. And in case you don't know what the prefixes inter and intra means, inter means between, like internet, between networks, okay, right? Intra, like intranet, if you ever had one, is internal, or inside. So according to the Constitution, okay, if you go to the 20th Amendment, okay? Oh, before I get there, Haley, how long does each Congress meet for? What's the duration of each Congress? How often are congressional elections held?
They're held every 6 years.
No. A senator's term is 6 years. How often are elections held? Right. Elections are held for Congress, representatives, and senators every 2 years. So how long does a Congress last for? Okay, good. Everyone get that. A Congress lasts for 2 years. This is important, I promise. Okay? Haley, within each Congress, how many times, let me ask a question like this. With the 20th Amendment, right? Congress is required to meet on January 3rd at noon. Okay? So every January 3rd at noon, a new Congress begins. We just had one about 3 weeks ago. So by the Constitution, every January 3rd, a new Congress meets. But generally speaking, Congress divides their term into sessions. There's going to be one in 2015 and one in 2016. Everyone with me so far? So every Congress has two sessions, one between 2015 and one between 2016. Haley, what do you call the break between the 2015 session and the 2016 session? What kind of break is that?
So that is the intra-session.
No.
Intersession.
Why is it inter? Because it's,
Why is it intersession?
yes,
Because it's like the actual end of the.
yes, it's between. So I like the word between because it helps. So for example, this would be between the 2015 and 2016 sessions, right? So we just had it January 3rd, 2015, a couple weeks ago. They'll have a session for roughly a year. And usually around Christmas break, in theory, they'll end one session and begin another one. Everyone okay with me with this, right? But during a session, Congress doesn't meet continuously, today at least. Sam, what do you think Congress does during the summer? During the months of July and August, what do you think Congress does? Do you think they stick around that swampy cesspool of Washington?
Intersession?
Yes. Summer break, right? Summer break is what we call an intra-session recess. It's during the session, or if you're inside the session, Congress goes home for summer break. They go home for the 4th of July. They fireworks and hot dogs and everything else, right? So during any given year, Congress has a session, and they might have some breaks that are intra-session, during, or they have the break that's between sessions, intersession. Everyone with me so far? If you don't get this, you're going to be lost in about 30 seconds. Everyone with me so far? Okay? So when we say the recess, and the Constitution says the recess, is it referring to intersession recesses or intrasession recesses? Chloe, only based on the text of the Constitution, right? Only looking at the text, nothing else. Does the Constitution tell us which recess we're talking about?
No.
Why do you say that?
Because all it says is the recess.
So let's do a little bit of grammar for a second, right?
Well, it's been interpreted to mean.
We don't need interpretation, we're doing grammar here.
Okay, well, the recess, to me, that would mean the formal recess between formal sessions, not the intra-session recesses.
Okay. So let's say, you're on the right track. So it's the recess, right? When I use the word the, that's something called a definite article. I'm referring to one thing. So if I say, I went to the building, right? The building. I'm not referring to any building. I'm referring to a specific building. If I said I went to a building, maybe I went to any one of many buildings, right? You see the difference. Every Congress, Chloe, I'll ask you a follow-up. How many intersession recesses are there in every Congress? How many intersession recesses are there in a Congress? Only one. Why?
Because it's between the
Yes.
6 month session.
There can only be one per Congress. Okay? There can only be one intersession. So linguistically, just linguistically, the article the suggests means one. If it said during a recess, it could linguistically be suggested to mean Christmas break, 4th of July break, Veterans Day break, all the little breaks they take. Okay, so that's just the text. All right, let's go back up top, Ian. Sir, let's talk about this next phrase. Vacancies that may happen. What does that mean linguistically? I don't want to hear about history or James Mattis or anything else. Just the text. What do you mean during? You said the word during. That word's not in there. But that's fine. What does it mean to have a vacancy during a break? Okay, so let's say to make it easy, the recess begins on December 1st, right? Some guy dies over Thanksgiving, dies in November. When did the vacancy happen? Was it before or during the recess? Is his death ongoing? So here, and I'm glad you said that, right? It depends what you mean by the vacancy. If you say that his vacancy arose when the guy died, it happened before. But if you say the vacancy is ongoing, it's the seat's still empty, I think Ian's interpretation has some weight. So here, again, depending how you look at it, linguistically, just language, you can read this either way. My point is, I'm trying to convey, this is not an easy case. This is a very tough case with arguments on both sides. Okay? So these are some of the primary questions that were faced in this case, all right? Everyone with me so far? All right, so let me give you a little bit of background on this case. I've written a lot about this case, and I've given a number of presentations. I won't do this often, but I do have some fun pictures to show you. So if you click through it, you already know. So one of the interesting themes of this case is a relationship between a gridlock Congress and the president's executive power. And this is a theme we'll revisit over and over again. And often we think of gridlock as something that's very bad, that's not desirable, where the political parties are butting heads and they're hating each other. Where there's basically a wall going down the middle of Congress. But I'd humbly submit that in many respects, and this is a point that Justice Scalia makes in his dissent, or concurring opinion, which reads like a dissent. You notice he didn't say I respectfully concur, he says I concur. That's a note of disrespect. Usually I respectfully concur, respectfully dissent. He's like, I concur. Drop the mic. Right? That's basically it. No, he's basically dropped the mic many times. So let's talk about one aspect of this gridlock, which involves the National Labor Relations Board. So the NLRB is a federal agency that manages labor relations and union laws and labor laws and things like this. If you ever take a labor class, which I strongly encourage you, employment law is very interesting topic. You'll learn a lot about the board. So the National Labor Relations Board is made up of 5 members, right? 5 so-called commissioners. And in order for the board to transact any business, 3 of the 5 seats need to be full. In other words, the president appoints people to this board for these 5-year terms. And then when something expires, the president appoints something else to the board. Okay? If for whatever reason the board drops below 3 members, they lose what's called a quorum. Everyone know what a quorum is? A quorum is the minimum number of people you need to do business. You can't transact any business unless you have a quorum. If you've ever been on a board or whatever, you need to have usually half people present. Okay? So, during the last presidential administration, during the Bush 43 years, a lot of liberals were not very happy because President Bush was appointing these conservatives to the board who were doing things that unions didn't like, and not really important what those were. Okay? So, a lot of union people said, you know what? We have to stop the president from appointing people to this board. The strategy was very simple. If we block the president's nominations to this National Labor Relations Board, they drop below 3 members. And if they drop below 3 members, they can't issue any, anti-union rulings, right? So this has been going on since the mid-2000s. So they say we have to shut it down. So it came to be that the National Labor Relations Board was stuck with 2 people. Look how lonely they look. I love this shot. They're in this hallway, this long hallway with nothing, which is a metaphor for what they were about to do. Nothing. So once they had only 2 members on the board, they could not transact any business. So basically, the National Labor Relations Board was shut down. Okay. This strategy continued. So in 2008, President Obama came into office, and the Senate was controlled by his party, the Democrats. So, unsurprisingly, the Republicans adopted the exact same strategy. As Scalia notes, the tables have been turned. So, whereas before Democrats were blocking Bush's nominations to the board, now Republicans were blocking Obama's nominations to the board. There's nothing new in politics. This has been going on for 200 years. Nothing is new. It's all the same stuff. So the president decided, you know what, I want to nominate this guy. His name was Craig Becker to the National Labor Relations Board. And this occasioned a serious political fight. What happened? All the various groups said, we need to vote against this guy Becker. He's this union hack. We have to get rid of him. We can't have him in office. And he was basically voted down, or he never came under. So after Craig Becker was voted down, the board was basically under fire. They were about to lose their 3rd seat because the 3rd seat was about to expire. And once they lose that 3rd seat, the board loses its quorum. The entire board stops it. They have to stop issuing rulings. Okay? So what happened? They turned to recess, right? The recess power. And we've already covered this, but the one of my favorite quotes by Mark Twain, no man's life, liberty, or property are safe while the legislature is in session. And as it turns out, even when they're in recess, it's not very safe, as we'll see. So we have this, a pro forma session, and I have a video for you to watch. So during the Bush presidency, right, the Democrats hatched this ingenious invention to ensure that President Bush could not make any recess appointments. Okay, what do? Here's the idea. Wait a minute. If the Senate never goes into recess, right? If the Senate never goes into recess, there can't be any recess appointments. Genius, right? Brilliant idea. So, I mean, on the one hand, the Senate could have simply, actually conducted business and transacted business every day of the year. Because if they're transacting business every day of the year, the Senate's never in recess, the president can't make any appointments. But that's a lot of work, right? And you know, during Christmas break, all the senators want to go home, right? They don't want to stick around cold Washington, D.C. They want to go chill in Texas or wherever, right? So they cooked up this invention called a pro forma session. A pro forma session, okay? What's a pro forma session, Connor?
Basically just a short period of time. It seems like it's like a clever invention just to circumvent the normal recess.
Good, good. So what happened in December of 2011, right? In December of 2011, the Senate basically set the scheduling order. Said, all right, every Tuesdays and Thursdays, so basically every 3 days, we're going to come in, we're going to have this pro forma session, and then we're going to finish. And we're going to keep doing this every 3 days to prevent the president from having any recess to fill the vacancy. So if I may, I hope this works. I have a video to show you. This was the actual pro forma session on January 3rd, 2012. It'll take maybe 25 seconds. There. Ready? If you blink, you'll miss it. Okay, it's scrolling. It's really quick. It takes 25 seconds to do the entire thing, but I want you to see how short this is. Videos never work when you want them to. All right, that'll come on when it comes on, but I'll keep talking. So effectively, the Republicans hatched this plan. They forced the Senate to never go into a recess. And every 3 days, they held one of these pro forma sessions. And the entire session is a senator not cooperating. A senator, here it is. I have screenshots because usually I don't rely on video. The senator gavels in. Oops. Gavels out. See, this is why I don't use PowerPoints, because they're very unreliable. They're not good in this capacity. Senator gavels in, says a few words, and gavels out. That's the entirety of the session. Okay. We'll get to those in a minute. So the question is. Was there a recess for purposes of the recess appointment clause? Okay, I'm almost there. This is why I don't use PowerPoint, because they're not very good. And if you do anything but a straight up lecture, it doesn't work. Here it is. There we go. Okay. So a senator gavels in, they say a few words, he gavels out. That's the entirety of the experience. So here's the calendar, right? On January 3rd, it's a Tuesday, they held a pro forma session. On January 6th, another pro forma session. On January 4th, the president made the recess appointments. He appointed about 5 or 6 people to various offices. Okay? Everyone see that? Can the president make a recess appointment during this break? All right? Everyone get the issue. So the actual decision itself is fairly complicated because there are 3 questions you have to answer, right? First, can the president even make an appointment during an intra-session recess? This date, on January 4th, was an intra-session recess. How do we know it's intra-session? Jacob, how do you know this is an intra-session recess? Yeah, it was during. Remember I said the Constitution says that the session begins on January 3rd? This was January 4th. So this was during. So this is not a case where the president made the appointment during the break between sessions, right? Let's see. Is that Karishma? Oh, no, Christian. Christian, why do you think the president didn't make the break between January 2nd and 3rd during that intersession break? Why would he not do that? Yeah, why would he not do that? Why wouldn't the president make an intersession appointment between January 2nd and 3rd when the Congress broke? Think about it. Go back to the text of the Constitution, right? How long does a recess appointment last? How long does a recess appointment last? It will expire immediately. Think about it. If the president had made it at the end of the 2011 Congress and before the start of the 2012 Congress, it will be immediately expired because the next section begins. As soon as this senator gavels, which this video doesn't want to work, but as soon as this senator gavels it, right, that session's done. So the president waited. Let's go back to our calendar. He waited to the first day, the very first day of the new Congress. Karishma, how long will this recess appointment last when you go on the very first day of the new Congress? How long will that last? Well, read the Constitution, right? Go back. When does it expire? Which is in 2 years. So basically, by waiting until January 3rd, the president got 2 full years out of the nomination. Had he done it a couple of days earlier, it would have been basically immediately expired. So he didn't want to do that. Okay? So we have this recess appointment. So the first question is, can the president make this intra-session recess appointment? The second question, right? If the president can make an intra-session recess appointment, how long must that break in action be? Assuming the president can make an intra-session recess appointment, how long must that break be? Is 72 hours enough? Is 3 days a sufficient length of a break to give the president the power? That's the second question. The third question has to do with these pro forma sessions, right? Between December 20th and January 20th, the Senate was empty every day. It looked just like this. There was no one there. All the desks were empty. All that happened was one senator, usually from Virginia or Maryland, to make it easy, right? You usually have one senator from Virginia, Maryland, come in, gavel in, say a few words, gavel out. Nothing is done during these pro forma sessions, usually. The government argued, wait a minute. Here was the government's argument, which most people don't actually appreciate. The government says, listen, this wasn't a 72-hour break. Congress was out for a full month. The government said, no. This wasn't a 72-hour break. Congress was out for the entire month of December and January. This was a full month break. This was a long recess. What about the pro forma sessions? Here's the key. The Solicitor General, the top lawyer of the government, said, those don't count. The Solicitor General says, we get to decide when Congress is in session, not Congress. And we, President, decide you are not in session. We decide you are in a recess, so bam, we're making our appointments on the very first day of the new Congress. Okay? These are the three questions, right? Can Congress make intersession appointments? What's the minimum length of the recess for such an appointment? And do the pro forma sessions count as breaks in the recess? Everyone with me? Stop me if you have any questions. This is not the easiest procedural case, but I think you should get the general gist of it now. Okay. So this case was approved by the government. Oh, yes, sir.
The January 3rd session,
Yes.
if it was pro forma and the government said that it didn't count, wouldn't it expire when the government said the new session really did start? I don't know if I'm asking if I'm framing it right.
I think I get your question. So effectively, the Constitution says the new Congress begins January 3rd, right? That's what. Yeah, that's a real. Even well, we'll be very careful though. Even if, right? Even if that's when the session began, there was nothing coming after it, and nothing coming before it. So effectively, what the government argued was there was this lengthy intra-session break that began in December. Okay, the government argued that there was a lengthy break to give him this power to do it. Ever see that? Something. It's a little bit of a tricky argument, but we'll see in Justice Breyer's opinion. The government said, the president said, I get to decide when Congress is in session, not Congress, and that was the problem because Congress, by its own rules, said we will be in session all these days. Yeah. Yes, sir.
You mentioned 3 questions earlier. I got the first one. What was the third one of those 3 questions?
Do the pro forma sessions, right? Do those count? Are those actually counting for purposes of having a Congress in session? Because if those pro forma sessions do not count, Congress was gone the entire month of December and January. They were in recess for basically 40 days. If the pro forma sessions do count, Congress was in session the entire month. They said these 3-day gaps between them. Everyone see the questions? All right. So had this case even get to court, which is a point which people may not appreciate. So the president appointed these 3 individuals to the National Labor Relations Board. Okay, and they had their 5 people. They're all happy, and they go on to issue a decision against a company called Noel Canning. Noel Canning is not a person. It's a company name. They were actually a canning facility. They bottled Pepsi Cola. They were actually, you can stuff. Right, they can stuff. Okay, so there were Pepsi, bottler, and canner in Washington and Yakima. And basically, this 5-member board issued a decision against them, which they didn't like. So what did they say? Hey, you guys might have 5 people, but 3 of you were legally appointed. Because 3 of you were legally appointed, you lacked a quorum. And because you lacked a quorum, the judgment against us is void. Everyone see that? If a government agent issues a decision against you, and the government agent was not lawfully appointed, they can't enforce the judgment. Everyone get that? So they went to court, the District of Columbia Circuit. And they said, listen, you guys, this is illegal. And remarkably, in a question that had been basically danced around for 200 years, the D.C. Circuit ruled in favor of Noel Canning. They ruled against the president. They said, the Court of Appeal said, no intra-session appointments. None. You can't make any. And oh, by the way, you can only fill positions that arise during the recess. So unless a person actually dies during that recess, you cannot fill that position. If he died the day before the recess began, can't fill it. So the case was appealed to our favorite, the Supreme Court. We'll be spending more time with these 9 than you'd like, unfortunately. Okay. So let's talk about the majority opinion first. Justice Breyer is an interesting justice. He was, for many years, he worked in the Senate staff for Senator Kennedy, and he also was a judge in the Court of Appeals. But as I said, his major belief in life is to make democracy work. That was the name of his book. We have to make democracy work. And we saw this in his Clinton v. New York dissent. He's like, listen, if Congress wants this line item veto, and the president wants this line item veto, even if it doesn't strictly follow the law, it's close enough, right? It's on the edge of constitutionality, he wrote. We'll give him the benefit of the doubt. So Breyer writes the majority opinion. And he poses these 3 questions, right? about the intersession recesses, about when the vacancies may arise, and about these pro forma sessions. The analysis Breyer takes is very interesting. We'll do Scalia later, because Scalia basically just tries to drop a bomb on everything Breyer does. It's his usual strategy. They're actually very good friends. This picture notwithstanding, they get along quite well, and they've taken their dog and pony show on the road a number of times. Then the other way, they've actually testified in Congress. I mean, they do a good show. It's very, very entertaining. But we'll focus on Breyer first, and we'll do Scalia. Okay. So the first part, Maurice, the first part of Justice Breyer's opinion focuses on the weight of historical practice. Maurice, what significance does Justice Breyer give to historical practice and what's been done before? Well, let's be precise. Is it stare decisis? What does stare decisis usually refer to? Which branch of government? The judicial branch. Right? We all know courts have precedents, and you file stare decisis of precedents. But we're not talking about court decisions here. What are we talking about? Who's they? You're on the right track. Who's they? Not the justices. We have to follow tradition of who has done before. Who makes the appointments? And who would object to them? Exactly. Exactly. This isn't stare decisis because there are no judicial decisions. Did you notice in this case that there were almost no cases cited? This was the first time in 200 years that the Supreme Court's been asked to resolve this issue. There are no precedents. So what Breyer says is, listen, we don't have any judicial precedents. We can't stare decisis this. We don't have anything. So let's look to the practices of the elected branches. Let's look to what the president has done. Let's look to what the Senate has done in response to that. And the briefing in this case, if you like history, lists hundreds of pages of different appointments made by different presidents in different times. It's a remarkable case. This is one of my favorite decisions the last decade, probably. But Breyer quotes McCullough, which we read about a week or two ago, right? That questions of separation of powers should receive a considerable impression from that practice, right? So when we're trying to figure out the separation of powers, Marshall said, let's look to what government actually does. And you may remember that when Chief Justice Marshall was deciding on the constitutionality of the bank, remember on the one hand you had Madison and Jefferson, and the other hand you had George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. Remember this? And Marshall's line saying, "Wow, we have such a collection of genius in one cabinet. Let's look to what they said. Let's look to what they did." So Breyer is making a big deal about practice. Okay. So in order to decide what the law is, let's look to what's been done before. I feel like Allen Iverson keeps saying practice over and over again. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google Allen Iverson in practice after class. It's just practice. Just talking about practice, right? So, but there's a tension here, right? The majority opinion was joined by Justice Kennedy. And you recall in Brandon, and you recall in Clinton v. New York, this was the line item veto case. Did Justice Kennedy care that both branches of government consented to this line item veto?
No.
What did he say?
He said that they can't conspire to give their own separation of powers.
Exactly right. What Kennedy said was that even if both branches of government agree, they can't fudge, they can't knock over these pillars separating the powers. So what's interesting is that Breyer cites Kennedy saying, well, usually the separation of powers can safeguard liberty. Yeah, usually that's the case. But, we don't want to upset the apple cart, right? This has been going on for 200 years without the courts being involved. Let's not do it. This is an epitome of Justice Breyer's what we call jurisprudence, his philosophy, in one paragraph, right? That paragraph I just described, that's it, right? Don't mess stuff up if they're already doing it and people aren't objecting to it. But we'll see in Justice Scalia's dissent that there are objections to it, and Breyer has to look past that. Okay? So the first part of Breyer's decision focuses on whether you can have inter versus intra-session appointments, right? Okay, just on my practice. It's a really good video. And Breyer goes back and forth, and he looks at dictionaries, and he looks at history. And what he finds is that during the first about 75 years of the Republic, there really weren't any intra-session breaks. Morgan, why is it the case that Congress never really had any breaks during the session? Why do you think that is? Think in terms of transportation, right? How do you think Congress managed their sessions when they're only there part of the year? What do you think they did? Why would the Congress in the 1800s not take a lot of intra-session breaks? What do you think they took breaks during? Think of the Texas legislature, right? They're only in session part of the year, right? When they're in session, do they meet every day? Just about. Why? Yes, yes. Think in terms of the early 1800s, right? When people are coming from all across the country to the cesspool of Washington. I say that lovingly, but it actually was a swamp, and literally that's what it was. It was a swamp. What we might call today a wetland. It was a swamp, which they filled out and dredged, and they built a city on top of. When people are coming from far away to Washington, they're going to work every single day for maybe a couple months and then get the hell out of town, right? So there was no need to have any intra-session breaks because they were going to be working every single day. The long break was between the sessions because they might finish up like in June and they might not come back till January. So you had these really long inter-session breaks and these very short, if non-existent, intra-session breaks. Maybe a day here, a day there, a couple days around, but not many. So it isn't surprising that there weren't any intra-session recess appointments during the first 70 years of the Republic because they didn't really take many. Okay? But then the history changes a bit. So we have Andrew Johnson, who again was, you probably know, was impeached and almost thrown out of office for making various appointments. We'll talk about that in about a week. He made a couple. And then after that, there had some more. And then finally, in 1921, you had an attorney general who issued an opinion. And he issued an opinion saying, yeah, intra-session appointments are fine. Okay? So Lauren, so let's think about this for a second. For the first 130 years of our republic, right, first century and almost a half of our republic, there were not really any intra-session recess appointments made. But since 1921, there have been, a bunch of them. What should a court make of that history?
Personally, I think we need to look at the first 130 years, because that's closer to when the founders and when the founders of the country. And so if you look at the first 130 years, there's a reason why there's no.
Well, what was the reason?
I think personally didn't agree with it.
Or what was the reason that Justice Breyer advanced why there weren't many? What I just said with Morgan.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but
Well, what's the answer? Why does Justice Breyer argue that there weren't that many intra-session appointments?
it's harder for them to.
Yeah, there weren't many long breaks, so there wasn't much of a need. If the president wants, he can just wait till the long summer recess.
But can you argue that was really their motive?
So here's the issue, right? We don't know. We don't know. All we have are these words, right? We start from these words. And Justice Breyer used the word motive, right? Justice Breyer seems to find a purpose in a statute. So you haven't taken any class on statutory interpretation. We have taken contracts, which has some shades of it, right? So you have a text, and you can figure out its meaning, right? And I think the meaning is the recess, meaning singular. But Justice Breyer draws a purpose from this text, right? Zachary, what's Justice Breyer's purpose? He keeps reading this over and over. He drones on over and over and over again. What's the purpose of this of this constitutional clause? Why did the framers insert this purpose into the Constitution?
To allow functionality.
Very good. Justice Breyer says, listen, the Constitution had an appointment clause, this one, right? Zachary, what if Congress had just stopped here? They didn't put a recess appointment clause. They only said the only way to get a recess appointment through is by having the advice and consent of the Congress. What if they ignored this? How would we read the Constitution then? Right. There's no other way. There's only one way. But, Zachary, I'll keep with you for a second. The framers added this second clause about the recess appointments. What purpose does Justice Breyer derive from this?
He envisions the framers' intent to anticipate changing circumstances.
Okay.
And they go into greater detail about how there are scenarios where if there's a vacancy or there's an issue where the president can communicate with the Senate that'll prevent some practice of going to bill forward.
Exactly.
So essentially, to safeguard the war situation, they can't move forward without any communication.
That's exactly right. Justice Breyer says the purpose of this recess appointment clause, the purpose is to create a functional, efficient, vigorous government. That government, first and foremost, should make it work. Keep things over again. Making democracy work. That's his book. He wants to make government work. And if you can read the Constitution one way to make it work, or a second way, as Justice Scalia does, to basically jam the entire thing up, he will go to the side of efficiency. That is his guiding, his animal spirit, if you will. That's his guiding motivation in everything he does. How do I make government operate more efficiently? Well, spirit animal, that's it. I don't remember, Harry Potter, right? Okay. So let's explore for a second an alternate purpose, right? Is that Emily? Emily, what's the purpose then that Justice Scalia derives from the text of the Constitution? What's his purpose? How does Justice Scalia envision this clause working? In a lot of circumstances, in a rare circumstance, how does Scalia view that clause operating?
That, by the word the intersection.
So did Scalia envision this power being used often?
No.
Okay. That's Justice Scalia. I'm sure he would tell you. Let's go see a picture of him, right? So if you ask Nino, right, it's like, well, Justice Scalia, what happens if some position arises during a break, during a short break in the Senate, and the president can't fill it? What if the National Labor Relations Board goes dark? What if these government agencies can't function? What would Scalia's response be? What would Scalia tell an agency that says, listen, we don't have enough people staffing here. We need more people. What's Scalia going to tell them? What was it? Tough luck. Too damn bad. And he probably would use those words or something very close to it. Justice Scalia would tell them, too bad. If the president wants to put someone in, he should work with Congress. If the president wants to fill those offices, he could work with Congress and put forward nominee they like. Or if there's, what happens, George, what happens in Scalia's mind, what happens if the Senate's out of town, right? Say they're home for Christmas, right? What could the president do if there was really an emergency? He could adjourn them. So this is a clause very, very rarely. It's happened, I think, maybe a dozen times, right? Okay? But I don't have it here, sorry. But the president has the power to convene Congress. He can call it an emergency session. So if there was really an emergency, something really important, the Constitution gives him the power to bring the senators back. And Scalia makes another point, right? James, maybe 150 years ago, it would have been really tough to have an emergency convention of the Senate, right? Today, is that so difficult? Why not? Airplanes, right? Probably within 24 hours if it was a true emergency. Say we're in the middle of a war and the Secretary of Defense is killed and we need a new Secretary of Defense. I'm pretty sure within 24 hours you can get a replacement done. Right? So Scalia says you don't need this. He actually calls the recess appointment an anachronism. What's an anachronism, James? What does that mean? Yeah, it's irrelevant. It's been irrelevant by the passage of time. Whereas once you may have needed this because people lived on farms, then take horses to Washington D.C. Now you get on an airplane, you're there in an hour, right? Even if you're in Alaska, farthest reaches of the United States Senate, you can be within D.C. within probably 18 hours if you take your the right flights. So Scalia says we do not have this kind of efficient government. But I want you both to see that there are valid reasons for both Scalia and Breyer, right? It's very valid to think that the Constitution was designed to operate in an efficient manner to promote effective government. I think it's also valid to argue that the Constitution was designed to provide a very strict method of appointing members of officers. Pedro, what does Scalia say, right? If we allow the president to fill vacancies at any time for anything, does he even need to go through the Senate anymore?
No.
What could he do?
You could, well, at any time, then you could just wait out the Senate.
Yeah.
Appoint between gavel drops.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go back to our favorite gavel drop, which the video is, I guess, still loading. Yeah, there it is, still loading, right? So what if on the first day of every session, right, the very first day of every session, gavel drops, he appoints 25,000 officers immediately. By tweet, right? He says, I now deem, I'm actually not exaggerating because how is it done on January 4th? How do you know the president made his appointments? He actually had a press release on the White House website and he tweeted it, that these people are now in office. So I'm only slightly exaggerating. But right, on January 4th, 2012, the president says, you know what? I'm going to fill 25,000 positions right now. All of them. Pedro, does the president need any advice and consent? Right. Now, how long do those positions last? What's the duration?
Until Senate comes back.
Which is how many years, basically?
Depending on 2 years.
More or less 2 years, right? So you're president for 4 years? Do that twice. You've just cut the Senate out of the picture. Now, Justice Breyer says, well, we can rely on the character of the presidency. The character of the presidency to ensure he doesn't abuse this. Gabriel, how does Justice Scalia respond to this trust in the character, the integrity of the office of the president?
Well, he says that it would infringe on individual liberty.
Yeah, how? Why can't we just rely on the president to be an honest dude?
Because, I mean, human being, he would essentially overstep his authority.
Good.
Why, to the question, why wouldn't we allow him? He's the elected official of the United States. The people voted him in.
Good.
Why shouldn't we trust his judgment?
Why shouldn't we?
Rely on his determination.
One at a time. No. This way, not that way. Raise your hand.
If Breeze requires opinion and you take the history behind this act, you could argue that there have been elected executive branches that have decided not to take advantage of this position. You could read it that way. So it's not completely erroneous that these elected officials have some sort of integrity and character. Congress may not have that much integrity and character. You could argue it both ways. Sorry.
Well, so I think we have two different positions, and they're sitting next to each other, so it's fitting, right? So one person said, listen, this is the president. He's the only officer in the United States who was elected by all 50 states by a majority of people, well, not necessarily a majority, but by generally a majority of people in all 50 states, right? Why shouldn't we trust his integrity to keep himself in check? And then someone else says, well, there have been examples of presidents who have abused this. Not to put too much of a fine point on it, but how did this entire case arise? You had a president who said, you know what? This has never been done before. In 200 years, no one's ever made an appointment during a 3-day break. I'm going to do it anyway. because my Office of Legal Counsel told me I could. If you read the opinion, it's laughable. Okay? Can we trust the executive to contain his own ambition? Thank you. Exactly. What did Madison say in Federalist 51? Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The ambition of Congress, of the Senate, must check the ambition of the presidency. And this is Scalia's point in his basically dissent. We can't trust any president to do his job honestly because they're going to take all the power they can and aggrandize it, bring all the power to themselves. The only way to prevent the president from growing his power is by the separation of powers and enforcing them.
But isn't that, shouldn't the president be able to check Congress's ambition as well?
Ah.
They have basically filibustered.
Oh, now you're talking my language. Okay, so I was going to get to that in a few minutes, but this is a good point. So we have a Congress where both when Bush was president and Obama was president, in both cases, the minority party in the Senate blocked nominees. This has been going on for, I mean, the last decade, more or less, right? So Justice Kagan, who is my new favorite, I am a Kagan fan. She made this point, and by the way, these are quotations from oral arguments, right? These are not from the opinion, but if you ever want to really learn, read the transcripts. This is where the good stuff is. So Justice Kagan makes this point, right? To the Solicitor General Don Verrilli, the top government lawyer. Listen, General, these recent appointments made, right? You're not trying to deal with congressional absence, right? If the president really wants, you could have convened them. But of course, we know the Republicans would have just voted down whoever Obama appointed. You're dealing with congressional intransigence. Yasmin, what do you think this means, congressional intransigence? What do you think that signifies? How does Congress's political agenda interact with the president's political agenda? Yeah, you want to add something, Elliot?
I'm just going to say that it's like the idea that they're not going to work with each other, they're not going to be flexible, and nothing can get done.
Okay, good. So effectively, Kagan goes to the Solicitor General. Listen, let's be real here, right? The president's not using this because Congress is out of town. Let's be real. The president's using his recess power to sidestep, bypass, if you will, an intransigent Congress that won't get along with them. And I think Morgan said that Congress is filibustering, and she's exactly right. So what does the government respond? And this, I think, is one of the key statements is why the government lost the case. And Scalia quotes this in his concurring opinion. This is Don Verrilli, the top government lawyer, really bright guy. He says, listen, the recess power, right, acts as a safety valve for intransigence. The recess power acts as a safety valve for the intransigence. What does that mean? And so if you want to use an analogy of a little teapot, right? When a teapot gets all steamed up, gets all, hot, what do? You lift the thing, and all the steam comes out. The president has effectively compared Congress, and this is the Teapot Dome scandal if you have any history, to a teapot. So what happens, right? What happens when Congress gets all steamed up? Well, you use this executive action, use this executive power to let some steam out and return us to a normal, well-functioning Congress. Right? You bypass that intransigence because the president says, listen, in a normal universe where the parties got along, my guys would get in. Mind you, the president himself, when he was the senator, filibustered all the time. He filibustered John Roberts and Sam Alito, but we'll put that aside for the moment. Right? When Congress gets all steamed up, let's let some of the steam out. All of the justices were very angry at this statement because it represents such an affront. We say the recess appointment power is meant to deal with congressional absence, right? We can all agree on that. But that's not what the president was doing. He was using it to sidestep the separation of powers. Justice Alito said this was, quote, a very aggressive argument in favor of executive power. Very aggressive. Okay, he has steam coming out of his ears. The Chief Justice, and again, President Obama filibustered his nomination. So as far as history, there's some history there. The Chief Justice said the Senate has an absolute right not to confirm nominees. Is that Renee? Oh, are you Renee?
Yeah.
Can you flip next time to the wrong seats? Wait, on the seating chart, yeah. Okay. So okay. So ma'am, does the Senate have to vote on any of the president's nominees? No. The Senate has no obligation to vote. I'll ask a related question. Does the Senate have to vote for any of the president's laws that he wants? No. So often there's this sense among people that, well, the president has a nominee, the Senate has to vote for it. Or the president has a law, the Senate has to vote for it. Pass a bill, as it's often said. Well, no. If the senators and Congress do not agree with something, they can exercise the few prerogatives they retain and vote no. So when they basically voted no on all the president's appointments to the board, the president said, all right, I'll do it anyway. Sidestep him. Put it on for 2 years, and he'll do it again. Okay? Even though Congress is fractured, all of the justices agreed that gridlock, intransigence, is not a justification. Okay? So that's Renee, right? Renee, Justice Breyer in his decision said, what happens if there's like a national disaster, a natural catastrophe? Could the president then exercise his recess power? Louder I can hear.
Yes.
Yes. So Breyer basically says, listen, if there's some sort of natural disaster or a catastrophe, doesn't say what that is. You know, say there was like a nuclear bomb that went off in like Washington, D.C. and all of his officers died, right? You know, God forbid. Could the president fill people because Congress is absent? Probably. I think that would probably be okay. But Renee, does the president, does gridlock, does this, clashing in Congress, does that constitute a sufficient crisis to give the president this power? No. So what Breyer says, nudged on by Scalia, he says, well, we only say this because Justice Scalia made us say it, right? We wouldn't say it otherwise, but only because Nino made us say it. Of course, gridlock does not justify. It's like, all right, Nino, you're right about this one, right? Breyer called gridlock, quote, a political problem, not a constitutional problem. And the point made is quite clear. When Congress won't get along, that means Congress is broken, or the president's broken, or whatever you want. Not our problem. The Constitution does not give you the power to bypass it because Congress won't pass your laws or confirm your nominees. Remember that for next week. Okay? The president always has the power of, if you know TR, the bully pulpit, right? The president has certain institutional powers to make Congress do what he wants. That isn't much valid today, perhaps, but that power exists. I'll come back to this later. Okay. All right. So we have this serious clash, but they agree on one very important point. All 9 justices agree that gridlock does not justify this use of executive power. Gridlock and intransigence does not justify these recess appointments. Where Congress doesn't agree on a nomination, the president can't bypass them. The president will have to wait for a real recess, not make one up in 72 hours. Okay. Everyone see that point? Questions? Yes, sir.
So basically, all 9 justices agree that because there's a gridlock, they can't override congressional powers.
Gridlock, constitutional powers.
Constitutional powers.
Gridlock does not provide a license to surpass the Constitution. Right? What the Solicitor General argued very carefully, he said it's a safety valve. Right? When you have all this gridlock in Washington, you can let some steam out with the Constitution. You can let some steam out making a recess appointment power. And all 9 justices agreed that's not going to fly. So the next time you hear people saying, oh, well, Congress won't get anything done, so he needs the executive to act, all 9 justices agreed that this is not kosher. This does not fly.
It seems like this effectively functions to allow Senate to either give the power to the president or not by either continuing the pro forma sessions or not.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So as long as Congress continues the pro forma sessions, there's no recess. Now, this one's a real inside baseball trick, right? Let's see if anyone can figure this out. In 2011, the House was controlled by the Republicans, and the Senate was controlled by the Democrats. If the Senate's controlled by the Democrats, why wouldn't they just go into recess, right? Why would they stick around and block their own president's appointments? Let's see if anyone knows this. Why would the Democratic Senate not go into recess? Yes. Yes, exactly. This is the beauty of this case. Article 1, Section 5, Clause 4. Neither house, without the consent of the other, shall adjourn for more than 3 days. The Republican House would not let the Senate adjourn to give President Obama a recess. Do you see what's going on here? This is why they met every 3 days, because they could only do 3 days without the House's permission. This is the gridlock of our Constitution. Can you imagine the foresight that you're effectively letting one house block recess so they can't get appointments? This is the unstated fact. The Republican House would not let the Senate go into recess. That's why they had sessions every 3 days. Most people don't even have no clue about that one. But yes, that's why the Democrat Senate wouldn't go into recess. Because if the Democrats could go, recess, point everyone, no filibuster. As it turned out, the filibuster has been eliminated for all judicial appointments other than the Supreme Court. So this is actually not much of an issue now. So long as the president's party controls the Senate, his nominees will go through, or her nominees will go through easily enough. All right, so everyone see that. There's so many political checks on this issue, on the recess appointment, that are baked into our Constitution. I think there's strong strength to Justice Scalia's position is that this was not meant to be easy, right? That appointing people outside the scope of advice and consent was really like an outlier. Okay, so everyone with me here. Okay, all right, so let's move on and let's talk about acquiescence. I know we're still in one case, but there's so much good stuff in this case. The actual decision was 120 pages, so you guys got a shortened version. I think I read the day it came out, so I reread it, this week. But the original was 120 pages. There was a lot of stuff in here, a lot of history they omitted. So let's talk about acquiescence, right? Is that Jennifer? Jennifer, let's go back to Youngstown for a second. We did this case, a couple, whatever it was. I don't have any function of time, but I know we did it. In Youngstown, right? What did Justice Jackson say about acquiescence, right? When the president does something and Congress doesn't really object, they don't approve it, they kind of sit and stay quiet. What do we make of acquiescence for purposes of the separation of powers? Good. And then what happens if Congress, we call it silent indifference, maybe they give it their tacit blessing, their quiet blessing, right? How should courts understand that kind of blessing? Good. So generally speaking, right, in Youngstown at least, Justice Jackson said, when Congress is silent and they say nothing, this is our zone of twilight, you may recall, right? Remember there were the 3 tiers? This one was the one in the middle, where it's not really clear what Congress thinks. Maybe they like it, maybe they don't. So we don't know. And in the absence of any affirmative consent, whatever you want to call it, courts will generally be cautious about invalidating an act of Congress. But last week, we did another case, or whenever it was Tuesday, again, I have no sense of time, INS v. Chadha. That's Megan? Megan, you remember in Chadha that the one-house veto had been used in dozens of laws, like 30 or 40 laws use them. When Congress does something over and over again, did the court care that Congress acquiesced to this Chadha case? Did they care that Congress kept doing the same thing over and over again? What did they say? Why? Does it matter how often something's done? That's exactly right. Chief Justice Berger's opinion in Chadha said, listen, even if Congress acquiesces something, that doesn't make it right. That the courts maintain an independent obligation to determine if something is constitutional. In fact, Berger went one step further. He's like, listen, if Congress is really crazy about some sort of power, odds are it's unconstitutional, right? The reason why they're focusing so much attention on this is they probably shouldn't be doing it anyway. You know, like when you're a little kid and you're doing something you're not supposed to, make a big, it's like, oh, check what I'm doing. Look, look at this cool thing. You probably aren't supposed to do it in the first place. In other words, if this was a boring, routine power, no one would make a big deal about it. But here, they're making a big deal about it. They're using it over and over again. So the question of acquiescence, though, has not been consistently applied. And this will torment you as you try to figure out your notes for this class. But on the one hand, we have Jackson saying, listen, if Congress is acquiescing to a practice, that probably means it's okay. Then we have Chadha. The court says, just because Congress used it, that doesn't mean it's okay. And then we have Clinton v. New York, the line on veto case, right? In Clinton v. New York, Mary, did Congress and the president consent to it? Did they both branches agree to it? Yes, they signed into law. With Clinton v. New York, Congress and the president agreed, we need this line on veto. Did the court care that both branches acquiesced there? No. And again, Justice Kennedy said, when you're dealing with the separation of powers, what's at stake is liberty. We cannot trust the elected branches to guard their own power. We cannot trust Congress. We cannot trust the president to guard their own powers. They cannot redistribute powers, give power to one, give power to the other. We must guard it independently. So we have three decisions which seem inherently in tension, right? You have Jackson saying acquiescence is good. We have Chadha and Clinton saying no, 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 it doesn't matter if they consent. That brings us now to Noel Canning. Job, what does Justice Breyer then say about acquiescence?
That because it had been going on for what he says, the kind of the history of the country, then that shows that there's intent and that should stand.
Okay. Breyer says if this has been going on for probably roughly 70 or 80 years, you notice he says it's not going on for 200 years because the first 130 years there were no intersession recesses. But since at least the 1920s or 30s, it's been going on. That's good enough for me. He will not upset the apple cart. That's what Breyer says. Crystal, is it the case, though, is Breyer right that Congress has acquiesced to this? Has there ever been objections to this practice? Have there ever been objections from members of Congress saying that this can't be done? What does Scalia say in his opinion?
No.
Why? Examples, please. I can't hear you.
I'm not sure what examples.
Hector?
From what I remember, Scalia said that there are individual senators
Yeah.
that have objected, maybe not through formal channels, but maybe through commentary.
Okay, good. So what Breyer says, that's exactly right. What Breyer says is as a body, Congress hasn't objected, right? So Senate as a whole hasn't objected, but individual members have. There are various members, there were different reports, there were different debates. People said, listen, you can't do this. Even more importantly, there were briefs filed by members of Congress. Senator Ted Kennedy, who was Justice Breyer's boss. Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts filed a brief in 2004 saying that intra-session recess appointments were unconstitutional. In this case, Senator McConnell, a Republican, said these are unconstitutional. So at various points, both parties have opposed this. Scalia says this great turn of phrase like the tables have turned because now the other party. So effectively, whichever party is in the minority does not like these because it allows a filibuster to be nullified. Now, again, the filibuster is gone for appointments. This is actually a dead issue because Harry Reid effectively what's called the nuclear option. He got rid of the filibuster for everyone but the Supreme Court. So the only position where you need 60 votes now is going to be the Supreme Court justices. Oh, if we have a Supreme Court nomination, it's going to be a fun one. Oh man, it's going to be it's going to be one of the biggest battles we've had in decades. Because I mean, a justice lasts 30 years. It's a long, long haul. Okay. Yes, sir.
Whenever you say the minority parties don't like these, what do you mean?
Intra-session recess appointments, right? Because minority party is trying to keep the Senate always in session so the president can't get his guys through. Guys or gals. Okay? So we have this debate over the text. We have this debate over history. We have this debate over practice. Practice, we're talking about practice, right? And effectively what happens is, I think Scalia and Breyer come to something of a I don't know if it's a draw, if you will, but they basically have strong arguments on both sides. And ultimately, Breyer holds in the end that you can make a recess appointment during an intersession or intrasession, both. Breyer holds for the majority that the president can make an appointment during either intersession or intrasession. That's the first question. Any questions on the first one? It's a long way to get there. It took a while. Okay? Questions on that? Okay. So the next issue the court has to confront is, okay, fine. He can make it during an intra-session break. We get that. How long must the break be in order for it to be an actual recess? So Scalia says, what happens if the Senate goes out for lunch, right? They take a 30-minute lunch break. Can the president fill all these positions? Okay, so now, Akani, let's go back to the text of the Constitution, right? Is there anything in these words which suggests the length that a recess must be, how long the break must be in order to get an appointment in? Is there anything?
At the end of your next session.
No, I'm sorry, the length of the recess. Is there anything discussing how long the recess itself must be in order for the president to exercise his power?
Deem recess, no.
There's no time limit, right? So I can contrast, I showed you this clause before, right? It says, neither house shall recess for more than 3 days, right? So the Constitution, the framers, they were familiar with time limits, right? They knew, if you don't sign a bill within 10 days, it's vetoed. You can't adjourn for more than 3 days. So there are very specific provisions added to our Constitution with time limits. But Connie, is there anything discussing how long the recess must be in order for it to be long enough for power?
More than 3 days.
Well, be careful. That's about the Senate adjourning. Why do you think that informs the recess clause? This is the point Justice Breyer makes. But why does this number make any difference?
Well, I think then maybe they're going to use that 3 days then to help them decide what the time limit would be too small.
Yes, exactly right. So this is what the Solicitor General argues, right? So listen, the actual recess appointment clause up here, it's silent. It doesn't say how long the recess has to be. But the Solicitor General says, listen, we don't know how long the framers thought was a good time, but we do know something else. They thought it was okay for the Senate to adjourn for 3 days without the permission of the other one. Basically, 3 days, 3 days is is like the minimum, right? 3 days doesn't even count. If the Senate can adjourn for 3 days without the permission of the House, 3 days is whatever. Okay? So we know 3 days is too short, right? So we got to be more than 3 days. Everyone see that? So we know the answer, whatever it is, has to be more than 3 days. Okay? So Vicky, what number does Justice Breyer arrive at as the actual minimum?
I think I read 10.
That's right. So he says, basically, if between 4 and 9 days, it's too short. You can't do it. Where does he get 10 from?
I have no idea.
No one does. No one does. So at least 3, we get it.
Didn't the 10 come from, you said, the longest intercession that he could find?
I'm going to get there in a minute, right? But that answers that you're right. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says 10 days. That number is nowhere in the text of the Constitution. But what he says, good.
Is that he said that the longest intercession that he had found where an appointment was made was 10 days. So he kind of took that precedent.
Good. So again, he looked to practice. We're talking about practice, right? He says, in light of historical practice, a recess of more than 3 days, but less than 10 days, is presumptively too short. Or to say another way, anything less than 10 days is too short. The 3-day part is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. Whether it's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it's too short. It has to be at least 10 days. Why? Aleda, why 10 days? I mean, why do we look to practice? I keep saying practice. Why do we look at the history? Why does Breyer think 10 days is appropriate?
I mean, because it worked out. I mean, if it's done in the past, then why shouldn't it work in the present?
Okay, good. If it's done in the past, do it again. The court should not interfere with the Senate. If they're okay with the 10 days, then so am I. Michelle, what does Justice Scalia make of the fact that there's no number in the Constitution, right? He says, we don't know the correct number of days, right? What does Scalia make of that fact? How does he interpret that? Anyone? This is Zachary?
Doesn't he say that acts as a carefully, carefully crafted restraint to the Senate?
Kind of, Crystal?
I think he didn't want to just make it into like being supported by practice, but be supported by jurisdiction, which is the Constitution.
Okay, good. I'm looking for a very specific answer. What does Scalia make of the fact that no number is given? What must the number be then? Anyone? If the Constitution doesn't give a number of days for the recess, what must the length of the recess be?
Leave it up to discretion.
No, not discretion.
Break shorter than 3 days?
No. 0. Scalia says, listen, he's still on issue number 1 here, right? He's like, if the Constitution intended to have these intra-session breaks, they will spell out how long they are. Because the Constitution didn't say how long these breaks have to be, that means none of them are valid. The answer is 0. The only breaks are those between sessions, because that has to happen by the Constitution. You need to have breaks between the sessions. You don't need to have these intra-session breaks. So Scalia says the answer is 0. And as again, Scalia is saying there's no intra-session breaks. So in the end, we have anything less than 10 days is presumptively invalid. Michelle, what does that mean, presumptively invalid? Presumptively. Focus on the word.
That basically it just can't be done, that it shouldn't be allowed.
Well, what does presumptively? If Breyer said they were invalid, what would the result of that? Just saying invalid. Would there be any wiggle room?
No.
Okay. But now what if he says in his opinion presumptively invalid?
Isn't it more like a guess?
Not a guess. Who decides?
The president?
The president or
Congress? Anyone who decides that it needs to be?
Who decides these things?
The official?
The courts, yes. So Breyer put in the wiggle room. Exactly. By saying presumptively, you are now making a possible lawsuit happen. If he said anything less than 10 days is invalid, period, the president would never do it. But by saying presumptively, he gives some discretion to the president. He gives some discretion to the Senate. And he gives a future judge the power to uphold an appointment. Because imagine a decision in 20 years saying, well, you know, the court in Noel Canning said presumptively 10 days, but here we have a situation that's very unusual, citing Justice Breyer's decision, so we'll uphold it. So at the very end of Justice Scalia's dissent, the very last page, if you turn to it, it's all the way at the end. I don't know, hold on 1 second. And he says, this is the sad thing. Hold on, let's see, where is it? Right. Okay, here we go. This is Scalia's last paragraph. I want to read this to you in parts. The real tragedy of today's decision is not just the abolition of limits on recent appointment powers. It's a damage done to our separation of powers jurisprudence. This is page 46, the last page. It's not every day that we get a proper case requiring interpretation of structural provisions. Most of the time, these things are left to the political branches, right? Our failure to do so today will resonate well beyond the particularly dispute at hand. Sad, but true. The court's embrace of this theory of executive power will be cited in diverse contexts, including those presently unimagined, and will have the effect of aggrandizing the presidency beyond its constitutional bounds and undermining respect for separation of powers. I concur in Judge Noel, drop mic. That's the only way I read that. What? I want to focus on these two words. Presently unimagined. Is that Tiffany? What's Scalia saying here when he's talking about this will be expanding power in circumstances presently unimagined? What's he talking about?
Maybe the future president's trying to use the power to extend the French unpleasant.
But let's focus, you're right, but what does it mean presently unimagined?
Because we never had any issue at the moment.
Do we know today how decisions will be cited in 10, 15, 20 years?
No.
But do we know they'll be cited?
Yes.
This is why Supreme Court justices get to pay the big bucks, okay? They're not just deciding the case before them. They're laying down precedents that they know will decide many cases going forward. We'll see in a number of cases this year that we read, the justices say, well, we're only deciding this case, and we're not deciding anything else. Yes, okay? Lower courts are going to cite these decisions. Lower courts are going to look to the word presumptively and give wiggle room. Perhaps the perfect example is Bush v. Gore, right? And you all know about Bush v. Gore. There's a paragraph from Bush v. Gore where the court says, this decision only affects this controversy and it's not meant to be applied anywhere else. Do you believe for a second that if a lower court has an election law issue, that they're not going to cite Bush v. Gore? Of course not. Of course not. So what Scalia is saying is, listen, by putting in this wiggle room, you're basically opening up to situations which we cannot envision. We don't know what's going to happen, right? If I had told any of you when President Bush was inaugurated in 2000, that his presidency we defined by locking people up in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, you'd have laughed at me. You'd have laughed at me. If I had told the justices during World War II that their decision involving detention of Japanese American Korematsu 70 years later will define whether the president can keep people locked up in Guantanamo, they'll say, what are you talking about, right? You don't know how decisions will be interpreted, right? While this may be a fairly minor issue, you know, whether these guys get points to the National Labor Relations Board, which is, in the grand scheme of things, insignificant. The separation of powers decision set precedents that go to circumstances that we cannot imagine. We don't know where this is going to take us. That's why I said at the outset, this is probably the most important separation of power decision since Youngstown. And the court blinked, right? They didn't go all in, even though they probably all thought they should, because of just talking about practice, right? They didn't go because of practice. And they didn't want to upset the apple cart. In contrast, in INS v. Chadha, another separation of powers case, they invalidated a practice that was applied in hundreds of laws. Clinton v. New York, they got rid of the line on the veto, which all branches of government wanted. This decision is very hard to square away, and Justice Kennedy in particular, with Clinton v. New York. I've attempted, I failed. But it's a very tough decision to put in. We studied the very first case in Marbury and also McCullough. Chief Justice Marshall said, listen, this Constitution was meant to endure for generations, right? We don't know what's going to happen. So there's two ways of looking at this. Breyer says, because I don't know what's going to happen, I'm going to put some flexibility, get some give in the joints, right? See what happens. Scalia says that flexibility permits the aggrandizement. One of my favorite words, okay? The aggrandizement of power. What does that mean, Cindy, the aggrandizement of presidential power? What's he talking about there? Okay, let me ask you this follow-up, Cindy. In any ongoing long-term struggle between the president and Congress, right? Ambitions checking ambition. The president's trying to take more power and Congress is trying to take more power. In the long haul, who's going to win that battle?
I mean, how that battle is decided by the judicial branch.
What does Justice Scalia think? Who wins that battle in the long run? He doesn't think it's a close call. I don't think it's either. Who wins that battle in the long term? Why do you say that?
I guess it's because Congress is composed of more people, and we have all these different views.
Who can act easier? One president or 535 members of Congress? Okay. Jason, let's go to you. Who in the long haul can focus his attention more on aggrandizing power? Congress or the president? Why?
First of all, his powers aren't as line itemed out in the Constitution. They're kind of more vague. And as we've seen through the years, the presidents have overstated, like Teddy Roosevelt, have expanded the powers of the president without, kind of, and it's been just acquiesced.
Okay, I think that's exactly right. In the long haul, right, this is Scalia's point. In any long-term controversy between the Senate and the president wins. Why? Because you have 500 members of Congress fighting with each other, trying to get this thing for the jurisdiction, that pork, and this and that bill passed. The president, though, he has one vision, and he can focus on everything. And it's been the history of this country in the last 70 years or so that Congress has ceded so much of their power. Talk about acquiescence. They've delegated so much of their power to the presidency. Then in the long haul, it's not even close. The president becomes much more powerful because Congress gives up its own authority. And then when they acquiesce to it, especially when the party in power is the same president's party, can you imagine that the Democrats start saying, oh no, President Obama violated the Constitution, right? So basically you have half the Congress in any given year in the camp for the president. It's very hard for the Constitution to win here. And that's why Scalia makes the point, and Kennedy made the point in Clinton v. New York, that you can't rely on the political branches to manage their own constitutional authority, that the courts need to step in to reinforce the separation of powers. All right, everyone see that point? It's an important point. We'll come back to this over and over again. But any long-term battle, the president wins. Doesn't matter, Republican or Democrat, Bush, Obama, doesn't matter. Each president takes power that his predecessor lacked. And whatever power this predecessor has, he adds on to that. Doesn't matter party. This is a bipartisan power grab. So questions on that? All right. So at the end we have question 2, right? Is 3 days valid? All the justices agree that 3 days is not valid. This is a ridiculously short time. Okay. But the government, and if I can find the calendar, I can go back to it. The government didn't argue that there was a 3-day break. They argued that there was a 20-day break. And that this pro forma session didn't count, right? Where they just gavel in, say a few words, and gavel out. Okay? Sean, tell me, how does Justice Breyer treat the short 3-day, the short 25, 30-second sessions? What does Breyer say about that?
Is it Breyer that decided they actually passed a law?
Yes! Good.
Obviously, it did matter.
Okay, so here's the deal, and if any of you have ever done parliamentary work, it's complicated stuff. But there's a lot of things in Congress where even though the room looks empty, stuff's still going on. So the Senate can actually pass laws with something called unanimous consent, where basically unless someone objects, the law is passed. So here's what happens, right? You have one guy in the Senate, one guy. He says, do I have unanimous consent to pass this law? If no one objects, the law is passed. Okay? But you might ask, Josh, wait a minute, but there's no one in the Senate, right? There's nobody there. Well, unless anyone objects, they can be there. But you say, oh, but Josh, they don't have a quorum in the Senate. There's no one there. Well, if one member of the Senate, I think we talked about this before, if one member of the Senate says, I like a roll call, right? I want to take a roll. And the clerk calls the roll. And if anyone's absent, you know what happens? The presiding officer calls a sergeant at arms to arrest any senator who's not present. I'm only slightly exaggerating. The sergeant at arms can go and gather physically everyone. And if they're back home in Minnesota, they grab them. But no one objected to the lack of a quorum. So Breyer says, listen, under the Senate's own rules, right, they've basically acquiesced to this bizarre practice where nothing's getting done, but they still consider themselves in session.
Okay, so they passed a law. Okay, another point, Neffy, could the Senate have, transacted business while they had these pro forma sessions? Could they have? Did they?
Not really.
No. So what the government said is, let's be realistic here. These sessions aren't governing. These sessions are meant to frustrate the president. Again, gridlock. The president said, listen, they're not coming into Congress to speak for 30 seconds and go home. They're doing this to mess me up. They're trying to break my appointments. Does that matter, Caleb?
No.
Why does it not matter?
Because I guess they've been doing it for a while.
Oh no, this is not a matter of acquiescence. Go back to the Chief Justice's point. Does the Senate have any obligation to confirm nominees?
No.
No. The Senate has no obligation whatsoever, none, zero, zilch, to confirm the president's nominees. They can either meet or not meet. They can meet and sit there and twiddle their thumbs all day. It doesn't make a difference. Right? So then Brandon, so does the majority hold that these pro forma sessions are valid sessions of Congress to break it up? That's right. So the third question, right? The court majority holds, and all the justices agree, all 9 agree, that these breaks, even if only lasting 20 seconds, are sufficient to consider it to be sessions of Congress. So the president waited only 3 days, not even. So it was a barely 72-hour break. Okay. All right. Everyone with me so far. Okay. So Jocelyn? Jocelyn, let's go to you. At the end of Justice Breyer's opinion, right, he makes this point, which I think is fairly powerful, about the role of the courts. Okay. The Senate has been doing something for a very long time. And we've talked about practice, it informs the Constitution, right? What does Breyer think about the courts inserting themselves into this dispute to frustrate that practice?
I think he takes the view that it would be appropriate and that Congress and President should work it out amongst themselves.
Okay. So what Breyer says is, if this is really a problem, let the political branches work it out themselves. Let the political branches fix this. If the senators don't like it, they don't have to ever go into recess, right? They can just be in session year-round. Okay? So Breyer says we look to the political process. Right? But Breyer makes another point, though, which I think is important. Scalia says over and over and over again that gridlock is a virtue. That gridlock means the Constitution's working. Stephanie, Breyer says, citing Hamilton in Federal 76, that we should have a vigorous federal government. What does this mean, a vigorous government? What does that mean to be vigorous?
I guess like strong, like kind of like going out. I don't know. I don't know how to explain the word.
Well, do you think so according to Justice Scalia, I'll say it to you for a second. According to Justice Scalia, if the Senate wants, they can basically screw up the entire government. If the Senate doesn't like the president's nominees, they can throw a wrench in the entire federal government and not confirm anyone. How do you think our government would operate if the Senate blocks all nominations? They just block everyone.
It wouldn't work very well.
No, it wouldn't. It would not work well. Do you think, in Breyer's mind, the Constitution was designed to be that susceptible to sabotage?
No.
Okay, good. So in Breyer's mind, Hamilton wrote in Federal 76, we want a vigorous government. Vigor, energy, right? Like proactive. We don't want a government that can be hobbled or crippled based on one party, if you will, a faction. We'll get to that later. So Breyer would not mess up the Constitution based on what he sees as an ambiguous text, right? He would not do this based on an ambiguous text. He writes at the end, Justice Scalia's interpretation of the clause would defeat the power. Okay? We interpret the Constitution in light of its text, purpose, and, quote, our whole experience. Breyer says we look to our whole experience as a nation, and we look to practice. Look to practice. Okay? And he drops his mic. Not nearly as dramatically. Breyer's great, but his rhetoric, it doesn't even touch Scalia. You couldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. Scalia's writing is par excellence for scathing. There's none better. Which is not always effective. Don't get me wrong. Writing with a scathing tone isn't always very productive. And if any of you ever do any writing in briefs, don't use his tone because you're not Scalia, and it'll come off obnoxious. Don't do it. For writing a blog post or whatever, fine. But the snark doesn't lend itself well. In fact, it's been reported that Justice Scalia's snark is, you know what snark means? Snide remark. His vicious tone has actually alienated other justices, and we'll talk about this during the year. All right, so that's Breyer. Any questions on Breyer? No ice cream? No, that's Breyer's. Yes, sir.
He said that Scalia restricted, like by narrowing these terms in the Constitution, Scalia essentially doing what?
He'd be allowing one party to throw a wrench into government. Scalia's interpretation of the Constitution, which means no intra-session, right, and the vacancies must arise during. In other words, the person has to die during the break. That makes the reappointment clause a nullity. It will almost never happen the president exercises power. So Breyer goes, listen, Scalia would basically write the reappointment clause out of the Constitution. And you want to know what? Scalia agrees. He calls it an anachronism. He's like, listen, this doesn't really matter anymore. We have airplanes that the president wants. He can call people into Congress. We don't need this power. We do not allow the Senate to get cut off. The president wants to appoint people, use the correct method. Right? This is an obvious question. Patrick, what happens if the Senate refused to confirm Craig Becker, whoever the president nominates? What's an option for the president? And what if they never went to recess? What's another option? Think about it. If the Senate doesn't like Craig Becker, what can the president do? Choose someone else. Choose someone else. In the spirit of compromise. If the Senate says no to this guy, choose someone else who's more palatable. I'm sure they'll say no to a lot of people, but eventually you'll reach someone in the middle who probably meets everyone's needs. Huzzah, right? So the aspect of executive action, all of its manifests, is about getting around compromise. It's like, nah, no time for this. Ain't got no time for this, right? You could have chosen someone else. And you want to know what happened as a postscript? He chose someone else. While this case was pending on appeal, the president and the Republicans reached a compromise to put 3 people onto the board for real. They reached a compromise. It happened. Miraculous. So oh, they can't. They did. So don't tell me that they need this power. They reached that compromise. And the people were much less extreme than Craig Becker. These are more moderate people. So imagine that. When you have a divided government, you have a moderate solution. Wow, that's miraculous. Well, but the executive action, had this been upheld, would have obviated that because we didn't need to. So it's in this sense, again, that the separation of powers reinforces the structure of our Constitution and ensures the middle ground is taken. Because when you don't allow each branch to check each other, the middle ground can be just bypassed. Okay? All right, so questions on that? All right, we have a few minutes left. Rebecca, you want to stand up for a minute? This is Rebecca Marshall. She's going to be your Langdell Fellow. And she took my class last year. She got an A. She did really well. And I strongly recommend you go to her sessions. You want to announce when they are and information, please?
Okay, so we start this first Saturday. It's going to be at 3:30. I have some schedules, but we ran out of paper and water this week, so I'm not really sure if there's enough to go around. But check it out. Definitely come. They're really beneficial if you really, prepare. And I can give you some really good tips on the way Professor Blackman tests. And I think we'll all have a great time. So it's every other Saturday, and it starts this Saturday at 2.
You should all go. I strongly recommend it. Jason?
You know a room number yet?
Yes. 316.
All right, so I'll write this up here. So it's room 316 this Saturday at 2:30?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. 2 or 2:30? Okay. All right, very good. So I'd recommend you go. Now's a good enough time to talk about the exam. We have a few minutes left over. See, 2 hours in one case told you it's a good case. So the issue for the exam, and Rebecca can talk to you at great length about this. Here's her email address, so you can, boom. Okay, so the issue for the exam, and sorry again. If you go onto my the syllabus, there'll be a link to last year's exam, so you can get a sense of what they look like. But the general format is going to be the same. There are going to be 2 questions, and each question will be an issue spotter. There's no multiple choice, there's no short answer. So there's just going to be 2 questions. Okay, one question is going to ask you to analyze a case under current Supreme Court law. So it's going to give you a very messy fact pattern with lots of facts and things to throw you in all different directions, but it's going to be a very good fact pattern. The second question will situate you at a time in American history. Okay, what do I mean by that? Last year I asked about the New Deal, I think. I can't remember. Or World War. So I don't remember what it was.
But you kind of restricted us by making us go back a little bit.
Yeah.
Before.
That's right. The second question, which is where this is where I really test. This is where I really test to see how you understand evolution of doctrine. What do I mean by evolution of doctrine? Do you understand how the court got from one place to the other? And the way I test that is by freezing you in a place. I'll say the year is 1936. The year is 1942. You're in World War II. The year is 2001, before 9/11. You know, the year 1791. The Bill of Rights was just ratified. The trick of those is you can't cite anything that comes afterwards. You have to actually use your knowledge of what existed there. And trust me, this is the best way of testing your knowledge on doctrine. I was so happy with the exams last year because people really killed it. You really nailed it. So, for example, there's a sample exam on the syllabus you can click on. It asks you to understand effectively Obamacare during the 1930s. So President Roosevelt instituted Obamacare. How would that have been held in the 1930s? I think that was my question last year, right? Right. So this forces you. Now, we'll get a lot of experience to this. One of the themes I want to develop, and Rebecca will help me develop them, is tracing various arcs of doctrine. So, I mean, even today we looked, okay, so in Youngstown, we have this very functional approach that looks on practice. And then in Chadha and Clinton, it's like, no, 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 we have the strict separation of powers. And then we have again in Noel Canning, oh, no, no, we look at practice, right? So the court, it's not a straight line. It's not like a sine wave. It goes back and forth with certain themes. And that's what I want you to remember and develop, okay? The exam itself is entirely open book. It won't help you at all, right, Rebecca? No, it won't help you. You can bring whatever you want, commercial outline, form book, I don't care, it won't help you. None of it will help you. But that's for your benefit. Because if there's an exam where you can get an advantage of bringing a book, I've written a very bad exam. If there's an exam where you can actually get a question right by looking at your notes, I have not done my job. I write these exams very deliberately and carefully, and I put a lot of effort into them. And if any of you take them for property, you will know that they're tough. But they're done for a very deliberate reason, because I want to judge you fairly. Unfortunately, in law school, you don't have a midterm, you don't have homework. You have one exam, and that's your grade. And I'm not necessarily a fan of that, but that's how the rules work in this school. And maybe they'll be changed, maybe they won't. I don't know. The other constraint, and let me explain this while I have a minute, is there's a word limit. So if you've taken me for property, you'll know that you have a word limit of 500 words per question. For ConLaw, I up it. So you have 1,000 words per question. Each question, you have 1,000 words. And let me explain why I have a word limit. When I was in law school, I could write faster than anyone else. I could spit out 4,000 words in an exam and pray that I said something else correct, right? I don't want to reward jerks like me, okay? I want you all, it's true, I want you all to be on the exact same footing. If you have only 1,000 words to answer a question, I can judge equally you and you and you and you, the exact same canvas to write on. This is the ultimate fairness in exam. And don't think it's unfair because everyone's able to write in that word limit. Even in property, where it's a 500 limit, everyone does it. Like 2 people each year don't and whatever, but generally people do it. Rebecca, word limit was okay for you?
It was fine. On the second question, I had to erase like 4 and 5 words a couple different times.
Yeah.
But it was fine.
You'll do it, okay? And time is not going to be your enemy. You have 3 hours and you have 2 questions. So you have basically 90 minutes per question. Was the time doable? Most people tell me they finish within 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Very few people actually don't finish. Well, I mean, you have a couple who don't finish, but they were probably doing something wrong. So my goal in the exam is to make this as fair as humanly possible. There are not going to be any surprises. Basically, anything we cover in class in the reading is your fair game. I won't ask you anything else. I'm not going to bring in stuff you haven't seen before. It'll be something you've seen before twisted in a very sick way. Like last year, I think it was like, could President Roosevelt require people to pay broccoli if they don't have to pay a tax? Like, so it's in the ballpark of what you studied, and you will relate to it. We will do at some point after the last day of class, a date to be determined, a review session where I will go over I'll go over last year's exam, and I'll take an A+ answer, maybe Rebecca's, I don't remember. I'll take one of the papers, we can go over it, and explain to you how a student last year did the exam, and that will give you a sense of what we're going to do going forward. And just, I actually take the exam myself, I write it in the space, and then so I can ensure it can be done. And yes, DC is like House of Cards. Okay. Frank Underwood, yes. So, all right, questions? Questions? All right, have a great weekend. See you all next week.
I like your product.